Hi everyone, it's Raquel here. In today's video, I'm going to share with you the 5 principles you need to know in order to maintain and keep a healthy sourdough starter that's going to help you make beautiful loaves of bread that rise really nicely. If you're new here, hello and welcome. I make videos all about enthusiastically and practically living out God's Word in your heart, home, and family. I would love to have you subscribe. And if you're not new here, hello and welcome back. Thank you for joining me today. Now, some of you may be wondering, what does sourdough bread and maintaining a sourdough starter have anything to do with living out God's Word? Well, in Leviticus chapter 23, verses 16 and 17, God gives us a couple of commandments concerning the Feast of Weeks, which comes 50 days after the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. God tells us in those scriptures to bring out of our habitations 2 loaves of bread made of fine flour, baked with leaven, which would have been sourdough in biblical times, to be brought to the priest as a wave offering before God as the first fruits of the harvest. Now, we don't have a temple today. We don't have priests that could officiate over a wave offering today. But at the same time, I still like to honor this commandment and remember this commandment by baking bread for Shavuot. And I just think it's also a really neat connection to those of biblical times and of those of times past, homemakers and bakers of times past who would have started their sourdough starters after the Feast of Unleavened Bread had ended, and then they would build it up, maintain it, make sure it's really healthy so that it can make these beautiful loaves of bread 50 days later for Shavuot, as God commanded. Now, of course, I do also bake bread for my family just for eating. In fact, except for, certain seasons of my life, like when I'm newly postpartum or something's especially hectic. I have been doing 100% of our bread products for the past 6 years using my sourdough starter. There's only 5 principles you need to keep in mind when you're maintaining your sourdough starter to make sure it's healthy and it's going to give you a good rise with your bread loaves. So today I'm going to share these 5 principles with you, and hopefully you'll implement them and you're going to have a very wonderful experience with sourdough. The first principle you need to know is that your sourdough starter, it has living organisms that need to be fed. And so just like you've been doing while you're establishing your starter, giving it fresh flour and water, you need to continue to do that to maintain your starter. In fact, that's really all maintaining a starter is. It's feeding your starter and using your starter. So first principle, feed your starter fresh flour and water on a regular basis. The frequency of how often you're going to feed your starter really depends on where your starter is, whether it's in the refrigerator or whether it's on the countertop, what your temperature is like, and what signs your sourdough starter is giving you. I personally choose to keep my sourdough starter on the countertop, and the reason why I do that is because I like to use my sourdough starter a lot. I use it on a daily or every other day basis, and I want to always have fresh sourdough starter that's active and just ready to go. That gives me more flexibility, allows me to be a little bit more spontaneous so that I don't have to pre-plan when I'm going to bake bread. Versus if I kept my sourdough starter in the refrigerator and I wanted to use it, I would have to take it out, let it warm up, give it a couple of feedings, let it get activated again. And so you have to have a little bit more forethought if you're going to keep it in the refrigerator. Now, the downside to having a sourdough starter on the countertop is that I'm going to have to feed it daily, sometimes twice daily, depending on the signs that it's giving me. Versus if I kept it in the refrigerator, I would only have to feed it once a week. When I say that I just follow the signs of my sourdough, what I mean is that I actually observe the way it looks. If my sourdough starter has, doubled in size, maybe it's overflowing out of my jar or whatever, that's a good sign that it's in an active stage, that it's not hungry. In fact, it's eating the sugars within the flour currently, and I don't need to feed it. It's happy, it's good. But if it has fallen back down, that might be a good time to feed it. Or if it has a layer of liquid over the top of it, that's also a good sign that it's time to feed it. To recap, principle number 1, you want to feed your starter regularly, whether daily, weekly, dependent on where you're keeping it, what signs it's giving you, and what your schedule is. So now we need to know how much fresh flour and water to add to our sourdough starter to maintain it. And this is where principles number 2 and number 3 come into play. If you remember, when we're establishing our starter, we want to give it about equal cups flour and water. But now that I'm on day 3, I'm starting to see a few little bubbles in here. If I smell it, I smell this kind of sweet, sour aroma, and that's the sourdough fermentation aroma that I'm smelling. I have good indication here that, yeah, yeah, things are fermenting. I'm catching some of my own wild yeast and bacteria, and that's a great sign. But now that it's day 3, I want to really start attracting the yeast in the air. I really want to start multiplying those yeast, and I want to have this starter start rising and falling to indicate that it's going to start rising bread loaves for me. And that leads into principle number 2 that you need to be aware of. The thicker your sourdough starter, meaning the more flour you have in there, the more yeast you're going to attract and allow to multiply, because they have more food that they're just going to gobble up and multiply. And that's going to lead to more rise. If you have more yeast, you're going to have more rise in your bread products and in your jar too. So just be aware of that. I've had many jars overflow before. And the way you get a thicker starter is you just add more flour to water ratio. So instead of doing equal parts flour and water like we've been doing for our establishing our sourdough, I might do, a cup of flour and only a half a cup of water. There's really no exact science here. It's really just about making the starter the consistency that you want. And part of knowing what you want is just experience and trying things out. So there is no exact measurement that I can give you. Many people like to say a thick sourdough starter is like a pancake batter. On the other hand, principle number 3, if you want more of a sourdough taste, then you want to attract more bacteria, which means you want a more wet starter. You want a thinner starter. In that case, you would add closer to the equal parts water and flour like we currently have with our sourdough starter. Depending on what I'm going to be using my sourdough for, I change whether my sourdough starter is thicker or thinner. If I'm going to be making a loaf of bread, I like it to be on the thicker side. If I'm going to be making pancakes, I like it to be on the thinner side. So it really, you can go back and forth. It's all the difference of how much flour to water you're feeding your starter at each of your feedings. So again, principle number 2, thick starter equals more yeast, more rise in your bread products. Principle number 3, thinner starter equals more bacteria, which is that sourdough flavor that you might be missing and wanting in your bread products. The 4th principle you need to be aware of is that you need to use your starter. And I want to clear up some confusion here about discarding your starter. You read a lot about discarding your starter and you're like, why in the world would I take half of my starter and throw it away? That's really not necessary. You don't need to throw away your starter. You don't need to discard it. You need to use it. If you continue to feed it but you never take from it, then it's just going to grow and grow and grow and grow. So that's the main purpose for discarding or using your starter, is you don't want it to just take over everything. But I've also noticed that the more you take from your starter, the more you use it and feed it again, the more mature it becomes, the better flavors it develops, the better rise power it has. It just becomes a more mature starter. So principle number 4 is really just to use your starter or to continually take from it so that it's not going to take over your life and so that you're going to get a more mature sourdough leavening agent. And finally, the 5th principle you need to be aware of are the signs of danger. Things are not going right. You have bad bacteria that have overtaken your sourdough starter. And really, unless you have just neglected your sourdough starter for a very long time, especially if it's out on the countertop, then you're not going to have an issue. Like, I've never had a sourdough starter go bad when I was regularly feeding it. I have had one go bad when I've just neglected it for several weeks at a time, and that's nasty. You kind of get like this dry layer of sourdough starter on top, that's fine. If you get that black liquid on top, that's fine. Really, if you have any concerns, smell it, look for fuzzy colorfulness, red, orange, those are not good signs, and just go look it up, go Google it, go look at someone's pictures or videos where they actually talk about the signs of a sourdough starter that's gone bad. Again, it's very unlikely that you're actually going to have an issue with your sourdough starter unless you just neglect it for a very long time, but it does happen occasionally. It's happened to me many times from me neglecting my starter. So just be aware of what those signs are that your sourdough starter is not safe for consumption. Alright guys, those are the 5 principles that you need to be aware of in order to keep and maintain a healthy starter. You can be as technical with your sourdough starter as you like. You can bring out the scale, you can bring out the grams and the exact measurements and all that if you like and you find joy in that. But I want you to know that none of that is actually necessary. Your biggest part of keeping a sourdough starter healthy is observation. Looking at your starter, looking for the signs that it needs to be fed, looking at your consistency, making sure that matches what you want, whether you want it thicker for bread, thinner for pancakes, or whatnot. Looking for signs that it's about to overflow your jar and either you need to use some or you need to go up to a bigger jar, and also looking for those signs that it's not safe for consumption. Observation is really the most critical thing with your sourdough starter to keep it healthy and maintained. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below and I will try to address them, possibly in another video if I get enough questions. I really want sourdough to go well for you guys. I love sourdough, so I want to make sure that your sourdough experience is successful if I can help at all. So leave your questions, leave your comments below. I'd love to get to them. I have one more video planned to share with you how to use your sourdough starter. I pray that all of you are blessed and doing well. I'm having a great time counting the omer with my family. I'm planning on having a couple of more videos about counting the omer, about the blessing that we do, kind of like our little tradition that we like to do each evening as we count the omer, as well as the couple of ways that we're counting the omer this year. It's different than last year. So anyhow, I look forward to talking with all of you in the comments. I pray that God blesses you and keeps you. I'll talk with you later. Bye-bye.